Welcome to the second part of a longer discussion about the SDGs, whether they're an overall good, the things they focus on, and whether we'll be able to achieve them. As with last time, I point out that this is a free discussion where we try to keep an open mind and welcome disagreements with each other in hopes it helps us gain a better understanding. We hope you'll listen with that same spirit. It's a beautiful day outside, and I'm recording out on my balcony, so I hope you'll forgive any background noises. A part of the discussion that I found particularly enlightening was that of the trade-offs required when trying to figure out how to approach achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We can't focus 100% on all of them at once, and sometimes progress on one can mean setbacks for others. In illustration of this, André brought up the trolley problem, which has seen increased relevance in recent years with the increase of AI-driven automation. I won't take up your time defining the trolley problem for you, but MIT created an interesting website about the topic as part of a study they did, and I'll leave a link to that site in the show notes where you can read up on the trolley problem and go through an exercise of judging for yourself several variations of this thought experiment around the topic of decisions made by self-driving cars. We kick off this half of the discussion partway through answering Erin's question about whether part of the issue with markets is that not enough negative externalities, such as pollution or carbon emissions throughout the product life cycle, are reflected in the prices of products. André had mentioned that there was no better alternative system for markets than capitalism, and continued to mention that the biggest challenges we currently face are issues around the tragedy of the commons. This part of the discussion starts with me responding to that, and then we get back more into an answer to Erin's question. I think that's enough scene setting. I hope you enjoy the rest of the discussion. As long as your goal is economic development, then maybe there's not a system that moves as quickly in that direction as capitalism. So if there's a better alternative to capitalism than that, probably not. But is there a better capitalism? Is another question you could ask on that. And I think we have to be asking that question. Assuming that even if capitalism is the problem, if we can agree that capitalism is the problem and we should do something else, us agreeing on that's not going to change anything. And capitalism is the predominant market structure right now, and I don't think that's going to change. So then the question is, what can we do within capitalism to make it work better, deal with the tragedy of the commons in a better way? Since that is one of the major issues that we're dealing with, as you point out, that if it's a common property, everyone's incentive is to take as much of it as they can.
It's also so hard to talk about, because it's such a big animal, right? Like capitalism, financialization, or debt, or there's all kinds of like shadows to that, like that I don't know enough about at all to have an informed opinion. But I think we need to somehow tame that bull, because I think markets are probably not necessarily a bad thing. Humans have always exchanged things and stuff, and I think markets will persist at the local level. I have some skills that somebody else doesn't have, or time that somebody else doesn't have, and I can exchange that for something that I may need or want that they have. But it doesn't necessarily all have to go about money, because so it gets really difficult, right? How do you exchange when it's not apples and apples or oranges and oranges? Then it's really quite difficult. To try to answer your question, Erin, I feel the problem is not that we haven't internalized the externalities, but the problem is to some extent that we're trying to put a price on everything. That's my personal opinion. I think André will disagree. I think that it is. I think it's almost disrespectful to try to marketize everything, because I think some things cannot be marketized. When we talk about property rights, the word rights within the property, I think there's something to be said about rights as well. Natural resources and forest are rights of the biodiversity, rights of other sentient beings. And I think that the way that we are developing AI and technology, so that's maybe a good thing, that we may be able to appreciate that we are not just the kings of this planet, but we have to find a way to coexist.
Yeah, this might be kind of an aside, but when I was in graduate school, we learned about health economics, and basically there's a way to calculate like the, I guess, worth of a life, and kind of like the marginal cost and marginal benefit of like, say, an intervention, and how many lives, well, you're willing to, I guess, give up, maybe, if for lack of a better term, and see like whether your intervention is financially viable or not. And um, I understand that it's necessary to kind of make those types of assumptions so that um, people can make financial decisions, but then it really didn't sit well or right with me because like you said, I think people are generally uncomfortable with putting a price on literally everything, including human lives. So yeah, that's what your response made me think of. Thanks.
Have you heard of the trolley problem, Erin?
Yes, right. The utilitarian.
Yeah. And there's something that kind of a sort of a version of that has been applied by some economists to the SDGs, just to kind of put us back in that direction a little bit. Yeah. Just looking at, and this again, the specter of trade-offs looms in the background here again. But what they were arguing was that we have to be very careful about, and this is very much an economic argument, but to be very careful about how to spend money on the SDGs because we don't have enough money to go around, basically, to achieve all of them. And for every dollar invested on towards a particular target, there's a certain return on investment, right? And they have a basic idea of what that's going to be. And that can be translated into lives saved as well. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they have done quite a lot of that work as well, not just dollars, but like how many lives could you save with this amount of investment? And it's very different depending on what you choose to do. So just these are very difficult moral questions as well. But for example, what was the example? And this is like about, I think it was about 7 years at the beginning of the SDGs. So this is a little bit outdated, but I think they were comparing HIV, mm-hmm. AIDS, and malaria. I think those were the two comparisons. And for every dollar that you invested in HIV treatment, you would get something back. And for every dollar that you invested in malaria, you'd get about 50 times more back. Wow. Just because of the way that the disease can be prevented, basically. Mm-hmm. Very mm-hmm. simple and low tech and easy to implement interventions like mosquito nets, for example, for malaria. So it's a very specific example, but there are the SDGs as a whole can be seen in that way, I think that is really important as well. And individual countries would have to do that, right? They'd have to see what are their priorities, short term and hopefully long term as well, and where they're going to put that money. I don't know how well that responds to what you were saying now, but just brought that.
No, I think that raises a really interesting point because I think maybe it comes back to our discussion on civic engagement a little bit because like how do we actually choose between all these different goals, right? Like, mm-hmm. like you said, it's difficult to achieve all of them at once, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch, so to speak. So how do we prioritize? And I guess part of it comes from like, stakeholders and what they want and, different voices within, say, a society and what they think is important. So mm-hmm. it does go back to values a little bit, I think. Yeah.
And upliftment, general empowerment and upliftment. So that was actually the other thing. Sorry, I'm monopolizing the conversation a bit, but just another thing I wanted to kind of throw into the mix was that recently I've become more and more convinced of how important it is to raise people out of poverty, like of whatever level of poverty it is, as an environmental goal, not just as a human dignity and human development goal, but as an environmental goal as well. Because the theory goes, and I want to get a little bit into why this is contested, but the theory goes that once people rise out of poverty, initially they're going to have an increased impact on the environment because they can basically consume more stuff. But then as they continue to develop past a certain point, that changes, and they start sort of, having the mental and physical space to actually care about the environment and invest in the environment. And so they actually contribute positively, and also they have fewer children, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the kind of general thing. So I think that that's like at the center of all of this. And, poverty alleviation is, as I sort of postulated earlier on, arguably the most important of all of the SDGs, according to the people who put the SDGs together. And I would say it might be the most important for that reason as well. But then the counter argument is the ecological footprint argument, that the wealthy are having the biggest impact on the planet, and the more wealthy people there are, the bigger the impact would be. But I regret that I didn't have the time to do it in preparation for this, but I've heard a lot of pushback against that recently, that the ecological footprint calculations are incredibly one-dimensional. They're basically all about carbon emissions, and they don't really take very much else into consideration. And they're huge gaps and huge assumptions. So I'm kind of inclined to think that raising people out of poverty is perhaps the most important solution to all of our problems. And then just one very quick thing to tag onto that is that the importance of trade generally. But maybe I'll bring that up later, because I don't want to complicate I've thrown too many things into the mix already.
Right. So that's one very important one way to view it, and it's probably also why SDG 1 is no poverty, and why MDG 1 was eradicating extreme poverty. It is, it's almost, and I really agree on that. How can you? So it's complex then for environmental institutes like our IGS. That you actually, in this day and age, I think if you want to make a convincing case for environmental sustainability, you need to combine this with the social necessities.
Yeah.
Because otherwise people are just not, how can I say, otherwise your message is not going to resonate in areas where it needs to resonate. Otherwise it'll just be perceived as a luxury issue. Like, oh, well, you have the time.
Yeah.
You're no longer hungry. You can be concerned about whether or not a certain species of butterfly survives in your country or not, right? That's it. So I think we do need to take social issues into account as well. But then the on the ecological footprint thing, André, that's maybe right, that it's quite difficult to measure many of those things, and that it certainly isn't perfect. I don't know enough about it at all, but we did a quick study, and it's very clear to see that the top 10 or top 50 of countries in the world that perform the best on the SDGs. There is a global index tracking SDG performance, and the top 50 are just top. They all have the biggest ecological footprints. And if you contest that, you can also just use something like material footprints. The biggest waste consumption, the biggest imports of materials from countries, and the biggest exports of waste to other countries. So prosperity is indeed important, and everybody would like to have a comfortable life like that. But if everybody were to live like a Greek god, I don't think there's space for it on our planet. So how do we do it?
Yeah, so this is kind of the pushback, and why I kind of regret not reading up more on this. But the thing is that those countries being at the top, maybe that's telling, because the countries that the very poor countries are one thing that they're characterized by is the degree to which people are required to be self-sufficient and to live off the land, basically. And so that means that instead of using, and this kind of opens another Pandora's box, but they need to hunt wildlife instead of farming manageable sized herds of cattle, for example. They need to chop down forests for wood instead of using coal or whatever other kinds of energy. And this is kind of where we enter the realm of facts, where we really should have the figures in front of us. But as far as I understand, that is why those people, those very poor people, are actually having a much bigger footprint. So it's a different kind of footprint, but all told, their impact on the planet is actually greater than it would be if they were wealthier. So this is kind of the big problem with the ecological footprint, is it leaves out critically important things and focuses on others. So, and the material footprint as well doesn't take that into account. And I don't really know. I mean, a lot has been said about this, right? The ecological footprint's been around for a long time, and they're still writing articles about it. But it's received a lot of critique, and I think it's largely because of this. We should actually have an episode about the ecological footprint. I think it could be really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think my main critique of the ecological footprint, I guess, concept is that it really puts the onus on individuals when there's so much of it that is so systemic, right? Like, I mean, I don't know where I'm getting my electricity from, but maybe I don't have a choice, right? And maybe I can't choose renewables, for example. And I don't know how these renewables were even made. I mean, they could be like mega solar, which may or may not be so good for, that local environment. So who really knows, right? And I think this concept of the ecological footprint is important to kind of contextualize, like how maybe one average person in one country might live as opposed to another country. But I don't know if there's like you said, there are a lot of problems with it, because I don't know how many people live like the average. I don't know if I live like the average Japanese person in Japan. Maybe not. And there are a lot of questions that come up for me with how it's measured and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. It just amazes me that it's kind of, I mean, but that's the whole problem, is that no one really knows, right? And we're all environmentalists. We don't know.
Yeah,
exactly
that's a problem.
Yeah. And I have read a couple of papers to try and inform me, and I'm still a little bit confused, to be honest. I've sort of given you a bit of a nutshell version of what I understand of it so far, but it's certainly...
I agree. Sorry to interrupt, but I agree. I think this warrants also a deeper discussion, but maybe with us having done some research to check a little bit, like do some homework on these things, because all I can say at this point is, I mean, I'm really challenged by what you just said, that poorer people that live directly off the land, of course, have a direct impact on the land as well, whereas people that live in cities and generally probably tend to be wealthier don't have a direct impact on the land in the same way as other poorer people do. But I just can't, I'm not convinced at this moment, André, just because, I mean, it makes me think of I can also just say SDG 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. And again, those top 50 countries, doesn't matter if it's Japan or South Korea or Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, all the Europeans, they all are performing really worse, very bad on SDG 12, because their consumption is not sustainable. And they produce immense amounts. No, let's not be as dramatic. They just have a very big per capita production of household waste. That's either burnt or that's exported or whatever. What not happens with it, and where I haven't done my homework is I can't clearly use facts and tell you where those products come from, and so where this production weighs heavily on the environment, whether that is in the consuming country or whether that is in another country. I don't know if it's all imported from China or from East Asia or not. But that's an issue for me. So yeah, I would have to return to this.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because you can actually focus in on that particular SDG 12, to talk about this question of developed versus developing, or poor versus rich world. Because I wonder whether they consider the resources that are being consumed and produced in poor countries. Probably they aren't, right? They're not including the trees that are chopped down and burned, for example, or the pasture that's used up, or the fishing grounds that are exhausted, or whatever. I think that as far as I know, that might
I think that's true. It goes all the way back to us saying, well, there's 169 targets, and it's super difficult to measure on the SDGs, and how much capacity do countries have to measure these things? That's all a given, but it is but in the index that is used globally, it's generally you find that developing Asia perform quite well on goals like SDG 12. Mm-hmm. So either that is because some of the areas that you have mentioned are not taken into account, simply aren't measured or can't be measured yet, or it is because of their biocapacity. That means the available natural resources that they have, their individual consumption still is much less compared to what they have available. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's probably a mix of both.
Yeah, and it could also be that particular SDG 12. Let's assume that it is quite comprehensive, and maybe that is one SDG in which the developing world is, doing a lot better than the rest of the world. That could be the case, but then there's 16 others, So, and I guess that would be the case, that there will be at least some where the developing world is doing better, even if the targets and indicators aren't really representing it well enough.
I wonder if we can pull it back to more towards the topic of SDGs and whether they're a net good or bad, or maybe how they're constructed is a net good or bad. We've touched on it a bunch of times, but the SDGs basically are covering as many elements of life as we can think of. It kind of seems like we're trying to cover the whole broad spectrum of where we could make changes that would impact society. And maybe that means that we can't, at least the SDGs don't help us focus on where we can make the biggest impact and where we can make a net positive. I don't know if the SDGs should be making a judgment on what's most important to work on. Maybe that's a big criticism of the MDGs. But do you think that having that overarching broad spectrum of things is good for the SDGs impact? And is it good for, I guess, the world in general? For awareness raising, it probably helps, I guess.
I think it's good for that. I think again, like we said in the beginning, it looks like the SDGs won't be achieved until 2065. Let's not talk about what might happen between now and 2065, by the way, because we might hit some tipping points before then that might put that even further out into the time horizon. But I think the SDGs as a norm setting, like as a conversation frame for people generally to consider how integrated we are with the environment and how integrated economic, social, and environmental issues are. I think it's a very useful framework. But it's not without its flaws. It still promotes economic growth within a finite environment. And if you take that to the broadest philosophical discussion, it is not possible to keep on promoting economic growth in a finite environment. So I think they're flawed, but we could think about what could come after that. It could be much worse as well.
Mm-hmm. I also think you kind of have to have all of them, but it'd be interesting to kind of look at what the SDGs cover that the MDGs didn't. Simon probably has a better off the top of his head idea than I do, but I think that leaving anything out would just kind of beg the question why. Why is that not being considered? But I think the important thing is what people do with the SDGs, what countries and individuals, or mostly countries and other institutions, companies, and that kind of thing do with it. I think I just have a bit of a beef with people who, I'm sure that there's hardly any country in the world that's really doing as much as it could, but I don't know, some activists who are kind of screaming at countries for not achieving all the SDGs. I think I just don't understand the complexities of doing it, and again those trade-offs between the different SDGs. It's just not that simple. This is an incredibly complex issue, and I think it does help quite a lot when you go down to the country level. It helps a lot more if you go down to the local level, local government level. I spent 10 years working in local government, and at the time, I don't think I really appreciated how important the role of local governments is, and I'm kind of appreciating that more now. Just that being able to kind of apply things directly rather than talk in this abstract way like we're talking now, which is also how national governments are forced to talk unless they're Singapore or Brunei or something. What was your original question, Bo?
It was just, is the broad nature of the SDGs a net positive, and is the broad nature harming how effective it can be, I guess, and whether we want it to be effective, which I think we've kind of answered that.
Yeah, I think to just kind of reiterate what I said now, I think that it's all down to how countries treat the SDGs, and you can't just talk about whether each of the goals is being achieved. You have to talk about sort of to what extent it's being achieved and to what extent one affects the other, and how important some goals are to some countries versus other countries, and all those nuances. It's a very nuanced discussion, and the more you include, the more nuanced it's going to be, or the more nuanced it has to be, because of that complexity just multiplies.
Yeah. I think there is definitely, this is definitely a question of, with anything broad and overarching, I think it's just a question of how it can be used, right? It can be a very good, powerful tool if it is applied in a way that was intended. But of course, on the other hand, since like we said, it's voluntary, one could just be like, oh, we care about the economic and social SDGs only, and we're just going to further those and we're all good.
It's called SDGs washing.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, there you go. So there's definitely the risk of that, right? And how we try to, I mean, of course, we're now facing like, I guess, we're gaining traction, like environmental issues and sustainability is gaining a lot of traction more generally as compared to maybe, 5-10 years ago even. And I think, it's going to become even more mainstreamed in the future. And I think that is a key issue that we're going to have to deal with. How do we make sure that people are not just saying, that they're doing the right thing and actually doing the right thing? And how do we make sure that people they're doing their best with the SDGs, but doing it in a balanced way, right? I think balance here is key because there's so many issues. But, like André mentioned, we can only choose maybe some of them in some cases, right? Like people with limited resources. So it's kind of like, how do we make sure that we're going generally in the right way, as opposed to, kind of severely, prioritizing one or the other.
I guess there's also maybe, I mean, on the one hand, I find it very difficult to let go of the idea that all of the SDGs have to be worked on at the same time. And I think I wouldn't not say that. I think they do all need to be worked on at the same time, even within an individual country. But I think it's true that some of the SDGs might give way to the others. So, for example, it's going back to the poverty example. If you address poverty in a country, a lot of the other SDGs are going to be a lot easier to address, right? And that's a long-term project. I don't think many countries are going to achieve that by 2030. And what that means, if you just to combine the two things I said now, what that means, I guess, is that countries, etc., should work on all 17 at the same time, but they might want to, or they might have to prioritize some over others in the beginning, in order to achieve all of them, maybe not by 2030. So then maybe that's a consideration as well.
Just to add on to that, I think, yes, of course, poverty is super important, but also I think the environment is, so if you could also take the view that the environment, the planet is sort of the foundation of this whole, of everything, right? This, in the society and the economy within the society, take this nested approach, which some use to argue for the importance of environmental sustainability. Of course, you cannot have a jungle without and then neglecting society's well-being. And that's not what I'm trying to say. But I think that of course, André, you're right. But the SDGs, the way I view it, have been predominantly interpreted like MDGs, like a development agenda, not like a sustainable development agenda. So that is why we are seeing the environmental goals 12, 13, 14, 15 are those that consistently are lacking behind. So if I were to say anything about very prematurely of what should come after 2030, if anything, if there's appetite for anything, I think we should just continue with the SDGs and then add some very smart targets on going beyond GDP. Let's measure success in different ways. I think that would help tremendously in reorienting priorities.
You made a very good point there, though, that basically the SDGs is actually a misnomer for most of the SDGs. It's really those 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, right? Those are the SDGs. The other ones are development goals, but they're not necessarily sustainable development goals. Is that wrong to say that?
Well, I mean, as the intention was, you have environmental aspects, social aspects, and economic aspects salt and peppered, or what do you call distributed across the 16 or 17 goals. So in effect, it is within the targets. It is integrated throughout. But just in terms of, as we have discussed before, that countries tend to prioritize what they'd like to tackle, and in that sense, it hasn't really been a paradigm shift. It is still pretty much. I mean, yes, it's still an incremental approach towards a more sustainable society, but I'm not convinced that we are doing enough on the environmental front. So we have to find ways in which we can combine, important social priorities, really important fundamental priorities for human beings with ecology, with environment.
Again, I think innovation has a very key role to play there, because if you make things easy for people, then it's just like letting water flow downhill, basically. And if you don't, then it's like trying to make water flow uphill. You can do it for a very brief amount of time, and that's it. But I wanted to kind of bring up another, I think, very key topic, which I think is central to Bob's original question, and that is the dynamics between countries. So the SDGs is a global endeavor, and if all countries got on splendidly all of the time, then that would be fine. But that's not the case, and it'll probably never be the case. So you got certain countries that are very strongly committed to the SDGs, and others who will follow them to the extent that they work for them, and no further than that. And I can imagine all sorts of ways in which the SDGs could be exploited. So, certain countries might be working hard towards them to their own expense, when compared with another country. And this depends on sort of the distribution of resources, for example, where those resources happen to be, where populations happen to be, where capital happens to be, and all the rest of it. So that's a pretty broad question. But I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. I have some sort of very general thoughts, but nothing very concrete. It's just something I'd be interested to hear your opinions on.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of what Simon said earlier. Like at HLPF, APFSD, when they're reviewing the SDGs, or they're reviewing, or countries are presenting their voluntary national reviews. I guess like there's that sort of peer pressure element to it and norm setting element to it. And I think maybe that is one of the, benefits of it being like a global effort, or globally maybe agreed upon a framework to strive towards. Because if, of course, like countries could, they don't necessarily need to be friends. I think maybe it might be the opposite, like friendly rivalries are maybe more productive in that sense, because then you would have like country A that's really looking at the progress in country B, and, maybe country A wants to do better than country B. So, maybe this country will do a little, or put in more work, or, I have no scientific, evidence to back this up whatsoever. These are just my ideas, but yeah, that's what came to mind.
Yeah, I guess that's certainly a factor, but I guess what I'm thinking of is kind of the darker, more sinister side of things, where countries that really don't care what the rest of the world think of them, except to the extent that it affects them economically. Yeah, that's the really the really tough side of this. And those are countries which they're the same countries that well, I guess now I've kind
of you're talking about my home country, right? Like Denmark is usually bad up.
Yeah. Especially Denmark.
Okay, here we go. Especially Lego. Yeah, that's right.
No, I'm finding it difficult to
brick by brick.
I'm just finding it difficult to talk about this without naming specific examples, and but I want to be able to include this in the conversation. But
but maybe think about that while then I'll try to say something on and then say something afterwards. I think the SDGs are, because they are so voluntary and so they're very little teeth and there's nothing binding. It's all so voluntary. So my impression is that even countries that are not going to give anything away for a fairer, more sustainable world, they will still join this process, as in so far as it doesn't harm themselves, and then they can say whatever they want and wish to anyway, and then they have done this international exercise. But the accountability isn't strong. I mean, we're calling it a voluntary national review. There's no international country by country peer review as some OECD environmental processes have. There's nothing like that. So I think there's no such rivalry. There might be for CBD or the UNFCCC, and you see much more conflicts being out in the open there.
But I guess my point is that so what you're saying is that nobody really has to do them, and what I'm saying is that everybody should be encouraged to do them. But there are some countries that just really don't care whether they do them or not, unless they don't affect them economically.
But they have. I mean, that may be true that the government at that point of time won't be interested in doing them. But then there will be, grassroots interest groups or civil to civic societies in those countries that say, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? You're not doing anything."
Okay, but that's
so there will be some things happening. I don't believe that there's any country in the world where there's nothing happening, but many different things happen.
Okay, but that's actually my other point, was that I think I disagree with that, because I think those same countries are the ones where grassroots organizations have virtually no voice. And I don't think that we really appreciate how oppressed grassroots organizations are in these countries. So in very democratic societies, there's an increasing pressure on governments to fulfill the SDGs. Basically, I think that the SDGs actually represent a lot of the sort of social justice discussions that have been going on, because they cover such a broad spectrum, environmental and social. Leave out the economic side from that argument. But then in authoritarian countries, the government will really do what it thinks is best for it, and those grassroots organizations are really, they really have virtually no voice. I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I think that's really the key point. So you'll have democratic societies trying to do the right thing to the extent that it might actually disadvantage them in a competitive way when compared with the countries that will just do what they want to do and will oppress whoever gets in their way. That's the dark side that I was referring to earlier.
Thank you for listening to About Sustainability. Please subscribe at podcast.iges.jp or search for About Sustainability wherever you normally get your podcasts. If you've got feedback, you can review us on your podcast directory of choice or reach out on Twitter at IGES_EN. About Sustainability is produced by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Any views expressed during the podcast are those of the speaker at the time of recording and do not necessarily reflect the views of IGES. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We don't take that lightly, and we hope you'll join us next time.